The fork trembled in my weathered hands as I set it down beside my untouched plate of meatloaf. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. After 43 years of grinding shifts, overtime hours that blurred into decades, and calluses that told the story of every sacrifice I'd made, this was supposed to be my moment of triumph. "I have incredible news," I said, my voice barely containing the excitement that had been building during my entire drive home through Seattle's evening traffic. Today was my last day at Morrison Steelworks. I'm officially retired. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable quiet of a family sharing a meaningful moment. It was the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes, heavy and ominous, filled with invisible fault lines about to rupture. My son Garrett's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips, his knuckles white against the ceramic. Steam curled upward between us like smoke from a battlefield. His wife Vanessa's perfectly manicured fingers stopped mid-motion as she was reaching for the salt, her expression shifting from mild interest to something that looked disturbingly like panic. I had imagined this scene differently during my commute. In my mind, Garrett would have stood up, maybe even embraced me, telling me how proud he was of his old man. Vanessa might have suggested we celebrate with the good wine we kept hidden behind the everyday bottles. Perhaps we'd toast to new beginnings, to family time, to the freedom that 4 decades of honest work had finally earned me. Instead, the overhead light cast harsh shadows across their faces, transforming my family into strangers. "What did you just say?" Garrett's voice carried a dangerous edge I'd never heard directed at me before. The same tone he probably used when firing subordinates at Cascade Marketing Solutions. "I said I'm retired, son." My smile wavered as I watched his face darken. 43 years of service. I've earned this moment. I thought we could. You thought wrong. The words hit me like a physical blow. Vanessa nodded approvingly beside him, her expression a mask of barely concealed irritation. "Garrett, I don't understand." "Of course you don't understand." He pushed back from the table so violently that his chair scraped against the hardwood floor like fingernails on a chalkboard. "You think money grows on trees, don't you, Walter? You think we're some kind of charity organization running a retirement home for old men who can't support themselves?" Walter. Not Dad. Not even father. Just my first name, delivered like an accusation. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in as I tried to process what was happening. This wasn't my son speaking. This was someone I didn't recognize, someone whose face carried an expression of pure contempt directed at the man who had raised him, loved him, sacrificed everything for his future. "I work 60 hours a week," Garrett continued, his voice rising with each word, "just to keep this household afloat. Mortgage payments, utility bills, groceries, insurance. Do you have any comprehension of what it costs to maintain a decent standard of living in this city?" Vanessa leaned forward, her voice sharp as broken glass. "My father worked until he was 72, Walter, 72. He understood responsibility, understood that you don't burden your children with your personal choices. Personal choices. As if a lifetime of backbreaking labor was some kind of selfish indulgence. "But I thought," I began. "We don't need another mouth to feed in this house," Garrett interrupted, each word carefully enunciated like he was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to march back to Morrison Steel and get your job back. Or you're going to find employment somewhere else. I don't care if you're flipping burgers at McDonald's or stocking shelves at Home Depot, but you are not going to sit around here living off my paycheck." The meatloaf on my plate had grown cold, congealing into something that looked as unappetizing as this conversation felt. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked, and I could hear the familiar sounds of suburban evening life continuing normally while my world imploded in slow motion. "Garrett," I said quietly, my voice sounding strange and hollow in my own ears, "you can't mean that." "I mean every word." His eyes, once bright with childhood wonder when I taught him to ride a bike, now held nothing but cold calculation. "You're 67 years old, not 90. Plenty of people your age maintain employment." My neighbor's father bags groceries, and he's 74. He understands what it means to contribute to society instead of being dead weight. Dead weight. The phrase echoed in my skull like a death sentence. Vanessa reached across the table and patted my hand with mock sympathy, her touch as cold as her expression. Walter, we're not trying to be cruel. We're trying to be realistic. This household operates on a very tight budget, and we simply cannot accommodate someone who refuses to pull their own weight. I stared at this woman I'd helped raise for the past 8 years, the woman whose wedding I'd helped fund when Garrett's marketing salary wasn't quite enough to cover their dream ceremony. She was looking at me like I was some kind of vagrant who had wandered in off the street, not the man who had worked double shifts to ensure her husband could afford the engagement ring she wore so proudly. I understand, I said finally, though I understood nothing. The world had shifted on its axis and I was free-falling through space with no reference points to guide me. Good. Garrett's shoulders relaxed slightly, perhaps interpreting my response as submission. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. It shows maturity. Maturity. After 43 years of supporting him, sacrificing my own dreams so he could pursue his education, working Christmas mornings and birthday evenings so he could have everything he wanted, he was lecturing me about maturity. What kind of work did you have in mind? I asked, playing the role they expected while my mind began to process this betrayal on deeper levels. Vanessa and Garrett exchanged glances, and I could see them relaxing as they assumed they'd won this battle without significant resistance. Something appropriate for your skill level, Vanessa said with barely concealed condescension. Service industry work, cleaning, maintenance, food service, entry-level positions where age isn't a significant barrier. Entry-level positions. After 4 decades of skilled labor, they wanted me to start over at the bottom of the employment ladder, competing with teenagers for minimum wage jobs that would barely cover my bus fare. I'll start looking tomorrow, I said, allowing defeat to color my voice, while internally I began calculating possibilities they couldn't imagine. Excellent. Garrett's smile returned, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd shown since I'd announced my retirement. I knew you'd see reason once you understood the situation clearly. The situation. Yes, I was beginning to understand the situation with crystal clarity. They began clearing dishes around me, their conversation returning to normal topics as if nothing had happened. Vanessa mentioned a sale at Nordstrom. Garrett complained about his commute. Ordinary domestic chatter that felt surreal after the bombshell they'd just dropped on my retirement dreams. I remained seated at the kitchen table long after they'd moved to the living room, where I could hear the television spring to life and their voices settle into the comfortable rhythm of couples who'd just resolved an annoying problem. In their minds, they'd handled the Walter situation efficiently and could now return to their evening entertainment. But as I sat there in the gathering twilight, staring at the empty chairs where my family had been moments before, something cold and calculating began to crystallize in my chest. They saw weakness where there was only kindness. They mistook generosity for desperation. They assumed their father was powerless because he'd chosen to live modestly. All these years, I'd protected them from knowing the full extent of what I'd achieved, what I'd built, what I controlled. I'd wanted them to value hard work and humility rather than inherited privilege. I'd wanted Garrett to become a man who earned respect through his own efforts rather than his father's success. Now I was beginning to realize that my strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of raising a son who appreciated sacrifice, I'd created someone who viewed sacrifice as weakness. Instead of teaching him the value of family loyalty, I'd somehow produced a man who saw family as an economic burden to be managed and minimized. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking the passage of seconds that were already becoming the before time. Before I knew what my son really thought of me, before I understood how completely I'd miscalculated the situation, before I realized that my retirement wasn't going to be the peaceful transition I'd imagined. I stood slowly, my joints protesting after the shock of the evening's revelations, and began the solitary task of cleaning up the dinner dishes. As I scraped congealed meatloaf into the garbage disposal, I found myself thinking about second chances and hidden truths. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities. Tomorrow, I would begin showing Garrett and Vanessa exactly who Walter Morrison really was beneath the facade of humble simplicity I'd maintained for so many years. They wanted to play games with their father's future. They wanted to treat me like some helpless old man who existed at their sufferance. Perfect. Let them continue believing that while I quietly reminded them that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. The house settled around me with creaks and sighs as I finished the dishes and turned off the kitchen lights. Upstairs, I could hear the muffled sounds of their evening routine, completely unaware that they'd just declared war on someone who'd spent 43 years learning patience, strategy, and the art of the long game. I climbed the stairs to my small bedroom at the back of the house, the room they'd allocated to me like I was some kind of elderly relative they were grudgingly housing rather than the man who'd bought and paid for every square inch of this property. My bedroom was modest by design, furnished with simple pieces that reinforced the image of Walter Morrison as a man of limited means and simple needs. A single bed, a dresser that had seen better decades, a nightstand with a lamp I'd bought at a garage sale. On the dresser, photographs chronicled happier times. Garrett's graduation from the University of Washington, his wedding day, family holidays when we all looked genuinely happy together. Had those smiles been genuine? Had Garrett's apparent affection been real? Or had I been seeing what I wanted to see while he was already calculating the burden I represented? I lay fully clothed on the narrow mattress, staring at the ceiling where shadows from passing cars painted moving patterns across the white paint. The house gradually settled into its nighttime quiet, but my mind churned with the dinner conversation that had shattered 43 years of assumptions. Through the thin wall separating my room from the master bedroom, I could hear Garrett and Vanessa preparing for sleep. At first, just the ordinary sounds of people brushing teeth and changing clothes. Then their voices began to carry through the drywall, initially just murmurs but gradually becoming distinct as they settled into their nightly debriefing. Can you believe he just announced it like that? Garrett's voice was clearer now, apparently not concerned about being overheard. I turned toward the wall, suddenly alert. They were discussing me, and their tone suggested this wasn't a conversation they expected me to hear. Like he was doing us some kind of favor, Vanessa replied, her voice carrying the same contempt I'd seen in her expression at dinner. 43 years of work, so what? That doesn't entitle him to retirement on our dime. Our dime. As if every dollar they'd ever earned hadn't been built on the foundation I'd provided through years of sacrifice and support. The timing couldn't be worse, Garrett continued. The mortgage rates are adjusting upward next month, and my bonus got cut because of the Henderson account falling through. We're already stretched thin without having to support dead weight. There it was again. Dead weight. The phrase that apparently summed up their assessment of the man who'd made their entire comfortable existence possible. What if he refuses to work? Vanessa's voice carried a note of genuine concern. What if he just sits around the house watching television and expecting us to support him indefinitely? Then we'll explore other options, Garrett replied, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. Adult assisted living facilities, senior communities, places specifically designed for people who can't manage independent living. The casualness of it struck me like a physical blow. They were discussing my future exile with the same tone they might use to debate where to store seasonal decorations. Those places are expensive, Vanessa pointed out practically. That's where his pension comes in handy, Garrett said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. We become his legal guardians due to age-related incapacity, manage his financial affairs, and use his own money to pay for his care. It's actually quite elegant. Elegant. They'd already researched the legal mechanics of stealing my pension and warehousing me with strangers. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to my retirement announcement. This was a premeditated plan they'd been developing behind my back. How long do we give him to find work? Vanessa asked. 2 weeks, Garrett decided. That's generous. If he hasn't found employment by then, we start exploring residential care options. I'll begin researching the guardianship paperwork tomorrow, just in case. Their laughter drifted through the wall, casual and cruel. I lay there absorbing every word, every dismissive chuckle, every cold calculation about my future. These were the people I'd loved unconditionally, supported financially, and sacrificed for emotionally. This was how they repaid 43 years of devotion. The house grew quiet again as they settled into sleep, but I remained motionless, processing this new reality. My son wasn't just financially stressed or temporarily overwhelmed by my retirement announcement. He was actively planning to seize control of my life, steal my pension and abandon me, to institutional care. But as I lay there in the darkness, absorbing the full scope of their betrayal, something else began to emerge from beneath the shock and hurt. A cold, methodical anger that surprised me with its intensity and clarity. They wanted to play games with their father's future. They wanted to treat Walter Morrison like some helpless old fool who existed at their mercy. Perfect. Let them continue believing that while I quietly demonstrated exactly who Walter Morrison really was. Garrett had made one critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed that a man who chose to live simply was actually simple. He'd mistaken kindness for weakness, generosity for desperation, and modesty for powerlessness. Tomorrow I would begin correcting those misconceptions in ways that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in this household. They thought they were managing a problem. Soon they'd discover they'd awakened something far more dangerous than they'd bargained for. I closed my eyes and began planning the first phase of their education. Sleep would come eventually, but first I needed to consider all the possibilities that 43 years of careful preparation had made available to me. The morning alarm penetrated my consciousness at 6:30 a.m., though I'd been awake for hours already. The bedroom felt different in the pale dawn light, like a backstage dressing room where I was preparing for the performance of a lifetime. I dressed carefully in my oldest work clothes, the ones that reinforced the image of Walter Morrison as a man of limited means struggling to make ends meet. Every detail mattered now: the worn boots, the faded flannel shirt, the jeans with carefully maintained patches that suggested financial necessity rather than fashion choice. Downstairs, Garrett was already in the kitchen, fully dressed in his marketing executive uniform. Tailored suit, silk tie, leather shoes that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. He looked up from his coffee as I entered, his expression mixing residual hostility from last night with tentative hope that I'd accepted their ultimatum. "Morning," he said cautiously. "Sleep well?" "Like a baby," I replied, allowing a hint of defeat to color my voice. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night." Vanessa appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. Her hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, her makeup flawlessly applied. She dressed for the role of successful executive wife, ready to witness their problem father's final surrender. "And?" she prompted, settling into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who expected good news. "You're right," I said simply, watching their faces brighten. I was being selfish, thinking only about what I wanted instead of considering the family's financial situation. Garrett's shoulders visibly relaxed. "I'm glad you understand, Dad. We're not trying to be cruel. We're trying to be realistic about our circumstances." "Dad." The word had returned now that I was behaving appropriately submissive. "I've been thinking about what kind of work might be available for someone my age," I continued, perfectly playing the role of the chastened father seeking guidance from his more successful son. "And?" Vanessa leaned forward eagerly. "Well," I said, allowing uncertainty to creep into my voice, "I'm not sure where to start. It's been 43 years since I looked for employment. The world has changed so much." This was exactly what they wanted to hear. Evidence that I was overwhelmed by the prospect of re-entering the job market, that I would need their help and guidance, that I recognized my dependence on their superior knowledge and connections. Garrett's chest puffed with newfound authority. "Actually, I might be able to help with that. There's a janitorial position opening up at my company, Cascade Marketing Solutions. Perfect." I could barely suppress the smile that threatened to emerge. "That sounds wonderful, son. Do you think I'd be qualified?" "It's cleaning offices and maintaining facilities. Vanessa said with barely concealed condescension. I think you can handle emptying trash cans and mopping floors. The pay is minimum wage, of course, Garrett added, but beggars can't be choosers, right? There it was, the phrase that would echo through everything that followed. Beggars can't be choosers. I'm just grateful for the opportunity, I said, injecting my voice with the humility they expected. When would I start? I'll speak to my supervisor today, Garrett said, clearly enjoying his role as the benevolent son helping his desperate father. Harrison Blackwell owns the company. Good man. Very understanding about family situations. I'm sure he'll take pity on you. Harrison Blackwell. I managed to keep my expression neutral, though internally I was calculating the delicious irony of this development. Garrett was going to ask Harrison to hire me as a janitor. Harrison, who had been begging me for 15 years to join his board of directors. Harrison, whose company I had quietly helped finance through 3 major expansions. That's very generous of you, I said. I promise I won't embarrass you. See that you don't, Vanessa said sharply. Garrett's reputation is on the line here. He's vouching for you personally. Indeed he was, and Harrison would certainly find that an interesting development. I'll call Mr. Blackwell this morning, Garrett said, pulling out his phone. Set everything up for Monday morning. Monday morning it is, I agreed, already anticipating how that conversation would unfold. The rest of breakfast passed in relative harmony. Garrett and Vanessa seemed genuinely pleased with how efficiently they'd resolved their Walter problem. I played the part of the grateful father, asking appropriate questions about expectations and procedures, while internally counting down the hours until the first surprise revealed itself. After they left for work, I sat alone in the kitchen with my coffee, finally allowing myself to smile. Phase 1 had exceeded my expectations. Not only had I convinced them of my submission, but Garrett had unknowingly provided me with the perfect stage for the revelation that would follow. I moved to the small desk in my bedroom and opened the locked drawer that contained files Garrett and Vanessa had never seen. Documents that told the real story of Walter Morrison's 43-year career. Financial statements that would radically reframe their understanding of our family's true economic situation. But those revelations could wait. First, I needed to make a phone call to an old friend who was about to receive a very interesting request from his employee about hiring a janitor. I dialed Harrison Blackwell's direct number, the private line he'd given me years ago for business discussions that required discretion. Walter, Harrison's voice boomed through the phone with genuine pleasure. How are you, my friend? Please tell me you're finally ready to accept that board position we've discussed. Hello, Harrison. Not exactly, but I do have an unusual request. Anything for you, Walter. You know that. This afternoon, you're going to receive a call from one of your employees, Garrett Cook. I believe he works in your marketing department. Cook, yes, I know him. Competent enough, though he lacks imagination. What about him? He's going to ask you to hire his father as a janitor, as a personal favor. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds. I'm sorry, Walter, but did you just say that Garrett Cook is going to ask me to hire his father, meaning you, as a janitor? That's correct. Walter, you own 42% of my company. You're one of the wealthiest men in Seattle. Why on earth would your son be asking me to hire you as maintenance staff? I leaned back in my chair, savoring the confusion in Harrison's voice. Let's just say my son has some misconceptions about his father's circumstances that need to be corrected. Misconceptions? Harrison's tone shifted as understanding began to dawn. Walter, what exactly are you planning? Nothing harmful, I assured him. Just educational. When Garrett calls, I'd appreciate it if you'd play along with his request. Hire me as a janitor. Let him think he's doing his poor old father a tremendous favor. And then? And then we'll see how long it takes him to realize who he's actually dealing with. Harrison's laughter carried genuine delight. Walter Morrison, you magnificent bastard. This is going to be better than dinner theater. I do hope so. Oh, and Harrison? When the time comes for the revelation, I'd like you to be appropriately dramatic about it. Really drive the point home. Consider it done. This is going to be the most entertaining hire in company history. After ending the call, I spent the rest of the morning reviewing documents and making additional preparations for what promised to be a very interesting Monday morning. Garrett and Vanessa thought they'd successfully managed their Walter problem. Soon they'd learn that their real problems were just beginning. The weekend passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Garrett and Vanessa treated me with the condescending kindness reserved for elderly relatives who'd finally accepted their proper place in the family hierarchy. They made small talk about my upcoming job, offered advice about working with younger supervisors, and generally behaved as if they'd successfully resolved a difficult situation through superior wisdom and firm guidance. I played along perfectly, expressing gratitude for their help while internally counting down the hours until Monday morning's revelation. Sunday evening, as we sat around the same kitchen table where this entire drama had begun, Garrett raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," he said with satisfaction, "and to family members who understand the importance of pulling their own weight." "To new beginnings," I agreed, clinking my mug against his while suppressing the irony that those words would prove far more prophetic than he could imagine. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear. I dressed in the janitor's uniform Garrett had helpfully purchased for me over the weekend, complete with work boots and a company polo shirt that proclaimed my new status as maintenance staff. The uniform felt like a costume for the performance of a lifetime. Garrett drove me to work personally, wanting to ensure I didn't get lost or confused on my first day. During the 20-minute commute, he provided a steady stream of advice about working in corporate environments, the importance of staying invisible, and the need to be grateful for any opportunity at my age. "Remember," he said as we pulled into the parking lot, "Mr. Blackwell is doing us a personal favor here. He doesn't have to hire elderly employees. Show appropriate gratitude." "Of course, son," I replied, adjusting my new uniform. "I won't forget who made this opportunity possible." The Cascade Marketing Solutions building was an impressive structure of glass and steel, representing Harrison's vision of modern corporate success. As we walked through the lobby, I noticed employees heading to meetings, discussing projects, conducting the daily business of a thriving company that I'd helped build through strategic investments and quiet financial support. Garrett led me through corridors I'd walked many times before, though always as Harrison's business partner, rather than as someone seeking employment. The irony was delicious. "There he is," Garrett said, straightening his tie as Harrison Blackwell approached from the opposite direction. Harrison looked every inch the successful CEO in his tailored suit and confident bearing. As his eyes met mine, I caught the brief flash of amusement he quickly suppressed before adopting an appropriately serious expression for this unusual situation. "Mr. Blackwell," Garrett said with the perfect tone of professional respect mixed with personal supplication, "thank you so much for agreeing to this meeting." "Of course, Cook," Harrison replied formally. "You said this was a family matter?" "Yes, sir. This is my father, Walter Morrison, the one I mentioned who needs employment." Harrison's gaze shifted to me, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure as he looked at one of Seattle's most successful investors dressed as a janitor and introduced as someone desperate for work. "Mr. Morrison," Harrison said carefully, "your son tells me you're interested in a maintenance position." "Yes, sir," I replied, adopting the deferential tone Garrett expected. "I'm very grateful for the opportunity. At my age, it's not easy to find work." "I see." Harrison's voice carried just the right note of polite consideration. "And you understand this is entry-level custodial work? Minimum wage? Basic responsibilities?" "I understand completely, Mr. Blackwell. I'm just thankful that someone is willing to give an old man a chance." Garrett beamed with pride at his father's appropriate humility. "Sir, I want you to know how much this means to our family. My father has been struggling since his retirement, and this opportunity will make such a difference in his life." "Struggling?" Harrison repeated, glancing at me with barely concealed incredulity. "Financially, yes," Garrett continued, unaware of the bombshell he was delivering. Dad worked as a manual laborer his whole life. Never really learned to manage money or plan for the future. We're trying to help him maintain some dignity in his declining years." The silence that followed was pregnant with significance that only Harrison and I could fully appreciate. Here was Garrett, explaining to one of his father's business partners that his father was an impoverished retiree in need of charity, completely unaware that he was describing one of the company's major shareholders. "I see," Harrison said slowly. "Well, Mr. Morrison, I think we can find something suitable for you. When would you like to start?" "Tomorrow morning?" Garrett suggested eagerly. "The sooner the better, really." "Tomorrow it is," Harrison agreed. "Report to the main reception desk at 8 a.m. sharp. They'll have your paperwork ready." As we prepared to leave, Harrison caught my eye one final time. The look we exchanged was loaded with anticipation for what tomorrow would bring. "Thank you again, Mr. Blackwell," Garrett said as we headed toward the exit. "You won't regret this decision." "Oh, I'm quite sure I won't," Harrison replied with a smile that carried meaning beyond Garrett's understanding. The drive home was filled with Garrett's satisfaction at having successfully managed another family crisis. He'd found his unemployable father a job, demonstrated leadership and problem-solving skills, and reinforced his position as the family's decision-maker and provider. "That went perfectly," he said as we pulled into our driveway. "Mr. Blackwell seemed impressed with your attitude. Keep that humility up, Dad, and this could work out well for everyone." "I'll do my best not to disappoint you," I promised, already anticipating how dramatically that statement would prove to be true. That evening, Vanessa prepared a celebratory dinner to mark my successful transition from retired burden to contributing member of society. As we sat around the familiar kitchen table, they toasted my new beginning with the same glasses where they'd delivered their ultimatum just days earlier. "To Walter's new job," Vanessa said, raising her wine glass with genuine satisfaction. "May it be the start of a more responsible phase of life." "To new opportunities," I agreed, clinking glasses while internally counting down the hours until they discovered what those opportunities actually entailed. Tomorrow would bring the second phase of their education. Tonight I would savor the anticipation of watching their carefully constructed assumptions crumble around them. Tuesday morning dawned with the crisp clarity of a day that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of our family dynamics. I dressed meticulously in the janitor's uniform, each piece a prop in what would prove to be the performance of a lifetime. At exactly 7:45 a.m., I walked through the glass doors of Cascade Marketing Solutions for what would officially be my first day as an employee, though I'd been instrumental in the company's success for over a decade through strategic investments and business partnerships. The reception desk was staffed by Jennifer Walsh, a young professional who'd been with the company for 3 years. I'd met her several times during board meetings, though she'd never seen me in maintenance attire. "Good morning," I said, approaching her desk with the appropriate deference Garrett had coached me to display. "I'm Walter Morrison, starting today in the custodial department." Jennifer's eyes widened with recognition that she quickly suppressed, clearly struggling to understand why Walter Morrison, major shareholder and frequent boardroom presence, was standing before her dressed as a janitor, claiming to be starting employment. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, her professional training taking over despite her obvious confusion. Let me get Mr. Blackwell for you." She picked up her phone with trembling fingers and dialed Harrison's direct extension. "Sir, Walter Morrison is here at reception. He says he's starting work today in custodial?" Her voice carried the uncertainty of someone reporting information that seemed fundamentally impossible. Within moments, Harrison appeared from the elevator, his expression perfectly calibrated between professional courtesy and barely contained amusement. "Mr. Morrison," he said formally, though I caught the glimmer in his eyes. "Welcome to Cascade Marketing Solutions. Are you ready for your first day?" "Yes, sir," I replied, maintaining the humble tone that had impressed Garrett so much yesterday. "Very grateful for this opportunity." "Excellent. Jennifer, please prepare Mr. Morrison's employment paperwork, standard custodial package." Jennifer continued to stare at both of us as if we'd all simultaneously lost our minds, but her professional training won out, and she began gathering the necessary forms. "Now then," Harrison continued, addressing me with the perfect tone of an executive speaking to new maintenance staff. "Let me show you to the supply closet where you'll find everything you need." As we walked through the corridors, passing employees who nodded respectfully to Harrison while barely acknowledging my presence, I marveled at how clothing could make a person essentially invisible. These same people had seen me in board meetings, had shaken my hand at company functions, but the janitor's uniform rendered me nearly transparent. "This is absolutely surreal," Harrison murmured as we reached the custodial supply room. "Walter, what exactly are you trying to accomplish?" "Patience, my friend," I replied quietly. "All will be revealed in due time." "And how long do you plan to maintain this charade? Until the lesson has been thoroughly learned?" Harrison handed me a mop and bucket with theatrical formality. "Your duties will include maintaining office cleanliness, emptying waste receptacles, and ensuring all facilities meet company standards. Do you have any questions?" "No, sir. I understand completely." As Harrison departed, leaving me alone with my cleaning supplies, I began the strangest workday of my professional career. For the next several hours, I mopped floors, emptied trash cans, and cleaned windows while observing the daily operations of a company I'd helped build. Around 10:30 a.m., I was cleaning the corridor outside the marketing department when Garrett emerged from his office. He spotted me immediately and approached with a mixture of pride and concern. "Dad, how's it going?" he asked, lowering his voice as if discussing a family member's medical condition. "Very well, son," I replied, leaning on my mop handle with appropriate weariness. "Everyone's been very kind." "Good, good. Remember what we discussed about staying invisible and being grateful? Mr. Blackwell specifically mentioned that he was impressed with your attitude yesterday. I'll do my best to maintain his good opinion." Garrett glanced around to ensure none of his colleagues were observing this conversation, then leaned closer. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I know this isn't easy, but you're handling it with real dignity." The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. Here was my son, congratulating me on my dignified acceptance of menial labor at a company where I was actually one of the primary decision-makers. "I learned from the best," I said simply, watching his chest swell with pride at the compliment. "Just keep up this attitude and everything will work out fine," he said before returning to his office, completely satisfied that the Walter problem had been successfully resolved. I continued my custodial duties throughout the day, all while calculating exactly when and how to reveal the truth. The setup was perfect. Garrett was completely convinced of his superior position, Vanessa was satisfied that I'd been properly humbled, and Harrison was positioned to deliver the revelation with maximum dramatic impact. By the end of my first day as a janitor, I had cleaned every office on 3 floors, earned the grudging respect of my fellow maintenance staff, and positioned myself exactly where I needed to be for the grand finale of this educational experience. As I prepared to leave at 5 p.m., Jennifer approached me hesitantly. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I have to ask, what's really happening here?" I smiled and handed her my empty mop bucket. "Sometimes, Jennifer, people need to learn important lessons about assumptions, respect, and the difference between apparent power and real power. Tomorrow should be very educational for everyone involved." The drive home with Garrett was filled with his satisfaction at how well his plan was working. His father had been successfully integrated into the workforce, was showing proper gratitude, and was no longer a financial burden on the family. "You did great today, Dad," he said as we navigated Seattle's evening traffic. "Mr. Blackwell even mentioned to my supervisor that the new custodial hire seemed reliable and hard-working." "I'm just grateful for the opportunity," I replied, maintaining the humble facade that had served me so well throughout this elaborate performance. "That's exactly the right attitude. Keep this up, and you might even qualify for a small raise after your probationary period." A raise. From minimum wage to slightly above minimum wage at a company where I was one of the largest investors. The irony would have been hilarious if it weren't so perfectly illustrative of how completely Garrett had misunderstood our family's actual circumstances. That evening's dinner was a celebration of successful problem-solving. Vanessa had prepared my favorite pot roast, though she presented it as a reward for my good behavior, rather than a gesture of familial affection. "I have to admit, Walter," she said as she served generous portions, "I wasn't sure you'd adapt to working life again at your age, but you've exceeded our expectations." Our expectations. As if my ability to perform basic janitorial duties was somehow surprising for someone who'd managed complex industrial operations for 4 decades. "I've learned that age doesn't have to mean uselessness," I said carefully. "Sometimes it just takes the right opportunity to prove your worth." Garrett nodded approvingly. "Exactly. And now you're contributing to the household again instead of being dead weight." There was that phrase again. Dead weight. The description that had crystallized my understanding of how my own family viewed me. "Speaking of contributions," Vanessa said, cutting into her pot roast with surgical precision, "we've calculated that your minimum wage salary should cover about 60% of your monthly expenses. The remaining 40% will come from your pension, which seems like a fair arrangement." Fair. They decided unilaterally how to allocate my income without consulting me, but they called it fair because they were generously allowing me to keep a portion of my own earnings. "That sounds reasonable," I agreed, while internally calculating how they'd react when they discovered the true scope of what they were attempting to manage. "We're also thinking about setting up a small savings account for you," Garrett added magnanimously. "Maybe 5% of your wages, just so you have something put aside for emergencies." They were planning my financial future like I was an elderly dependent who couldn't manage his own affairs. The patronizing kindness was almost worse than the outright hostility they'd shown during their ultimatum. "You're both very thoughtful," I said, raising my water glass in a mock toast. "I'm lucky to have family who care so much about my welfare." The rest of dinner passed in comfortable domesticity. Garrett discussed his projects at work, carefully editing his descriptions to avoid revealing any information that might confuse his simple-minded father. Vanessa talked about her book club and weekend shopping plans, secure in the knowledge that the Walter problem had been permanently resolved. After they retired to the living room for their evening television routine, I remained at the kitchen table, ostensibly reading the newspaper, but actually reviewing the timeline for the revelation that would follow. Tomorrow would be Wednesday, my 3rd day of employment. By now, Harrison would have had sufficient time to fully appreciate the absurdity of the situation. Jennifer and other employees who recognized me would be thoroughly confused by the cognitive dissonance of seeing a major shareholder performing custodial duties. Most importantly, Garrett would be completely confident in his management of the family crisis, certain that he'd successfully reasserted his authority and resolved the burden of supporting an unemployed father. Perfect conditions for what would follow. I folded the newspaper and climbed the stairs to my modest bedroom, where I spent the evening making final preparations for Thursday morning's board meeting, a regularly scheduled gathering that Garrett knew nothing about, where Walter Morrison would resume his proper role as one of Cascade Marketing Solutions' primary decision-makers. The irony was delicious. While Garrett slept peacefully, convinced he'd solved his father problem through superior leadership, his father was preparing to demonstrate exactly who held the real power in this relationship. Wednesday passed much like Tuesday, with one notable addition. During my lunch break, I received a text message from Harrison. "Board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. as scheduled. Should I prepare anything special for the occasion?" I replied, "Just your usual impeccable timing and sense of drama. Tomorrow will be memorable." That evening, Garrett came home with particularly good news. His supervisor had complimented him on successfully managing a difficult family situation, using it as an example of leadership and problem-solving skills that could serve him well in future promotional considerations. "It's funny," he said as we sat down to dinner, "how solving one problem can open doors you didn't even know existed. Mr. Blackwell specifically mentioned my handling of your employment situation as evidence of mature judgment." Mature judgment. Harrison had certainly enjoyed that conversation, knowing full well that Garrett's mature judgment consisted of asking one of his father's business partners to hire his father as a janitor. "I'm glad my situation could help your career," I said truthfully, though not in the way Garrett understood. "It's all about taking responsibility," Vanessa added approvingly. "When families face challenges, someone has to step up and make the hard decisions. Hard decisions, like forcing your father into minimum wage employment at a company he'd helped finance." "Tomorrow should be particularly interesting," I said, allowing a note of mysterious anticipation to color my voice. Both Garrett and Vanessa looked at me curiously, perhaps catching something in my tone that didn't match their expectations. "Interesting how?" Garrett asked. "Oh, just the usual workplace dynamics," I replied vaguely. "You never know what each day will bring." Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of reckoning. I dressed in my janitor's uniform one final time, knowing that this would be the last day I'd need the costume that had served me so well in this elaborate performance. The drive to work with Garrett was filled with his usual commentary about workplace politics and the importance of maintaining a low profile. He'd grown comfortable with our morning routine, secure in his role as the successful son providing transportation for his employed but still dependent father. "Remember," he said as we pulled into the Cascade Marketing Solutions parking lot, "today's Thursday. That means the monthly board meeting is happening on the executive floor. Stay clear of that area completely. The last thing we need is you accidentally interrupting important business." The monthly board meeting, where Walter Morrison was expected to provide input on quarterly financials, strategic planning, and major corporate decisions. "I'll be extra careful," I promised, suppressing the smile that threatened to emerge. "Good. These board meetings involve very serious people making very serious decisions about the company's future. It's not a place for maintenance staff." Indeed, it wasn't a place for maintenance staff, but it was exactly the right place for major shareholders to reclaim their proper roles and demonstrate the difference between assumed authority and actual power. I entered the building at my usual 8 a.m. starting time, greeted Jennifer at the reception desk, and collected my cleaning supplies from the custodial closet. For the next 45 minutes, I performed my janitorial duties while internally counting down to 9:01 a.m. At 8:55, I quietly made my way to the executive washroom adjacent to the boardroom. I hung up my janitor's uniform, revealing the expensive business suit I'd worn underneath. From my small duffel bag, I retrieved Italian leather shoes, a silk tie, and gold cufflinks that transformed me from Walter Morrison the janitor into Walter Morrison the investor. At exactly 9 a.m., I walked through the boardroom door where Harrison Blackwell and 7 other executives were already seated around the polished conference table. "Gentlemen," I said, taking my usual seat at Harrison's right hand, "good morning. I hope you'll excuse my slightly unconventional arrival, but I've been conducting an interesting experiment in workplace dynamics." The transformation in the room was immediate and electric. Every executive present knew Walter Morrison as one of the company's most influential decision-makers. Seeing me emerge from what they'd assumed was a janitorial background created the kind of cognitive dissonance that stops conversations mid-sentence. "Walter," said James Fitzgerald, our chief financial officer, "we weren't sure you'd be attending this month. There were some unusual reports about you, working in maintenance." "Ah, yes," I replied, settling into my chair with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "That's precisely what I wanted to discuss this morning. You see, I've been conducting a fascinating study in family dynamics and workplace hierarchy." Harrison leaned back in his chair, clearly anticipating the story that would follow. "For the past several days," I continued, "I've been employed as a custodial worker here at Cascade Marketing Solutions. My own son, Garrett Cook from your marketing department, personally arranged my hiring because he believed his father was an unemployed retiree, desperately in need of minimum wage work." The silence that followed was pregnant with disbelief and anticipation. "Your own son had you hired as a janitor?" asked Patricia Reynolds, our chief operating officer. "While knowing you're one of our primary shareholders?" "That's the fascinating part," I said, allowing satisfaction to creep into my voice. "He doesn't know. My family has been operating under the impression that I'm financially dependent on them, a burden who needed to be forced back into the workforce to avoid becoming what they called dead weight." The executives exchanged glances that mixed shock with growing amusement as they began to appreciate the scope of what I was describing. The irony, Harrison added with theatrical timing, is that Garrett came to me personally, asking me to hire his struggling father as a favor to their family. He explained that Walter was a former manual laborer who'd never learned to manage money properly. The laughter that erupted around the table was rich with appreciation for absurdity that transcended normal workplace experience. "So what happens now?" asked Richardson, our head of strategic planning. "How long do you intend to maintain this educational experiment?" I checked my watch. 9:15 a.m. Actually, the education begins in about 15 minutes. Garrett should be discovering right about now that his reliable janitor father didn't show up for work this morning. As if summoned by my words, Harrison's phone buzzed with an internal call. "Mr. Blackwell," came Jennifer's voice through the speaker. "I have Garrett Cook from Marketing Online too. He says it's urgent regarding his father." "Perfect timing," I said. "Harrison, would you mind putting that call on speaker? I believe everyone should hear this." Harrison pressed the speaker button with obvious relish. "Cook, what can I do for you?" "Mr. Blackwell, I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but my father didn't show up for work this morning. I can't understand it. He was so grateful for the job, so committed to proving himself. I'm wondering if maybe he had some kind of medical emergency." The concern in Garrett's voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt a pang of something that might have been guilt. Then I remembered the nursing home conversation, the casual planning of my exile, and the steely resolve returned. "Medical emergency?" Harrison repeated, glancing at me with barely suppressed amusement. "He's 67 years old, sir. Sometimes elderly people have episodes, confusion, disorientation. I'm worried he might be wandering around Seattle, lost and embarrassed about missing work." Lost and embarrassed. The image Garrett had created of his confused elderly father was both pathetic and insulting. "I see," Harrison said carefully. "And what would you like me to do about this situation? Could you possibly give him one more chance? I know how much this job means to him. It's restored his sense of purpose, given him dignity. If he shows up tomorrow, I promise he'll be reliable from now on." Dignity. The word hung in the air like an accusation, given what Garrett had put me through to earn that dignity. "Mr. Cook," Harrison said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I think you and I need to have a conversation about your father. Could you come to my office immediately?" "Of course, sir. Should I bring anyone from HR?" "No, this is a family matter that requires privacy. Top floor, executive suite. I'll be waiting." After Harrison ended the call, the boardroom erupted in anticipatory laughter. "Walter," said Patricia, "this is the most entertaining board meeting in company history." "The next 15 minutes should be even more interesting," I replied, straightening my tie and preparing for the confrontation that would finally reveal the truth about Walter Morrison's actual circumstances. Harrison stood up, addressing the room with mock formality. "Gentlemen, ladies, I believe we're about to witness the resolution of the most unusual employment situation in corporate history. Shall we adjourn to my office for the finale?" The executive suite's glass walls provided perfect acoustics for what followed. At exactly 9:35 a.m., Garrett's knock echoed through Harrison's office. "Come in," Harrison called. Garrett entered with the demeanor of someone expecting to discuss a family crisis with a sympathetic employer. His expression was appropriately concerned, his posture deferential, his entire presence that of a middle manager seeking understanding for his problematic elderly father. He stopped mid-stride when he saw me sitting in Harrison's guest chair, no longer wearing a janitor's uniform, but dressed in the expensive business attire that marked me as someone who belonged in executive offices. "Dad?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "What? Why are you here? Why are you dressed like that?" I stood up slowly, enjoying the confusion that was spreading across his features like spilled ink on white paper. "Hello, Garrett," I said calmly. "I believe you wanted to discuss my employment situation with Mr. Blackwell." "I don't understand." Garrett's eyes moved frantically between Harrison and me, trying to process information that didn't fit any framework he possessed for understanding our family dynamics. Harrison leaned back in his executive chair, clearly savoring this moment of revelation. "Mr. Cook," he said formally, "I'd like you to meet Walter Morrison, one of Cascade Marketing Solutions' founding investors and largest shareholders. He owns 42% of this company." The color drained from Garrett's face so completely that I worried he might actually faint. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and his briefcase slipped from nerveless fingers to hit the floor with a sharp crack. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Is it?" I asked gently. "Tell me, son, what exactly do you think I did for 43 years at Morrison Steelworks?" You worked on the factory floor, manual labor. You always said." "I said I worked hard. I said I put in long hours. I never said I was just another factory worker." I moved closer to where he stood frozen in the middle of Harrison's office. "For 43 years, I was Morrison Steel Works. I built that company from a small fabrication shop into one of the Northwest's largest industrial operations." The truth was hitting him in waves, each revelation more devastating than the last. But you live so modestly. The small bedroom, the old clothes, the careful budgeting." "I chose to live modestly," I corrected. "There's a significant difference between poverty and simplicity, though apparently you never learned to distinguish between them." Harrison pulled out a file from his desk drawer and handed it to Garrett. "These are the incorporation papers for Cascade Marketing Solutions," he said. "You'll notice your father's signature as one of the founding investors. He provided the initial capital that made this company possible." Garrett's hands trembled as he opened the file, his eyes scanning documents that rewrote everything he thought he knew about his family's financial situation. 15 years ago, Harrison continued, when we needed expansion capital for our Portland office, Walter provided another $250,000 in development funding. 3 years ago, when we acquired Morrison Digital Solutions, that was facilitated by Walter's connections and financial backing. "Morrison Digital Solutions," Garrett repeated numbly. "That's named after your father, yes. He owns 60% of that subsidiary as well." I watched my son absorb this information, seeing his entire worldview crumble around him like a house built on sand. "The job," he whispered. "You asked me to hire your father as a janitor." "Actually," Harrison said with obvious enjoyment, "your son asked me to hire you as a janitor, as a personal favor to help his struggling family manage their unemployed burden." The silence that followed was deafening. Garrett stood surrounded by evidence of his father's success, finally understanding the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice cracking with the weight of realization. "Why didn't you tell me?" I sat back down, studying this young man I'd raised but apparently failed to truly know. "Because I wanted to see what kind of person you'd become without the influence of inherited wealth. I wanted to know if you'd respect your father for who he was, not what he owned. And the answer, unfortunately, is that you wouldn't. When you thought I was powerless, you treated me like garbage. You called me dead weight. You planned to steal my pension and warehouse me in a nursing home." Each word was delivered with surgical precision. "You showed me exactly who Garrett Cook really is when he thinks he has power over someone else." The accusation hung between us like a sword. We were just trying to be practical," he said weakly. "Practical?" My voice rose for the first time since this confrontation began. "You were trying to solve what you saw as the Walter problem. You never once considered that maybe there was more to your father's situation than met the eye." Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps," he said, "this would be a good time to discuss Mr. Cook's continued employment with Cascade Marketing Solutions." Garrett's head snapped up, a new fear replacing the shock in his expression. "Sir, I can explain." "Can you?" Harrison's voice carried the cold authority of someone who'd built a successful company and didn't tolerate disrespect toward his business partners. Can you explain why you thought it was appropriate to ask me to hire one of my primary investors as minimum wage custodial staff? Can you explain why you described Walter Morrison as a former manual laborer who'd never learned to manage money? I didn't know. You didn't know because you never bothered to learn. In 3 years of working here, you never wondered why your last name was Cook, but the company president seemed unusually interested in your family welfare. You never questioned why your performance reviews were always slightly more favorable than your actual work merited. Another layer of revelation crashed over Garrett as he realized that even his professional success had been influenced by his father's hidden connections. "Mr. Blackwell, please," Garrett said desperately. "I can make this right somehow. You can clean out your office," Harrison said with finality. "Your employment is terminated immediately. Walter, I assume you don't want this person representing your interests within the company any longer?" I looked at my son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The ambition without wisdom, the arrogance without accomplishment, the willingness to abuse assumed power over those he perceived as weaker. "No," I said quietly. "I don't believe Garrett Cook represents the kind of values we want associated with Cascade Marketing Solutions." The words hit him like physical blows. In less than 20 minutes, he'd discovered his father's true wealth, realized the scope of his own ignorance, and lost the job that had been the foundation of his adult identity. "Dad, please," he said, and for the first time since this began, I heard genuine remorse in his voice. "I can change. I can learn from this." I stood up, straightening my jacket with the authority of someone who belonged in executive offices and corporate boardrooms. "Perhaps you can," I said, "but you'll have to do it somewhere else, and you'll have to do it without the financial safety net you've taken for granted your entire adult life." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the house you've been living in, it's mine. The car payments I've been covering, that ends today. The college loans I quietly paid off, consider those my final gift to your education." The full scope of what he was losing began to register in his expression. "You're cutting me off?" "I'm treating you exactly the way you planned to treat me," I replied calmly. "When you thought I was powerless and dependent, you were prepared to take my pension and abandon me to strangers. Now you get to discover what it feels like to be truly on your own." Harrison stood up, clearly indicating that this meeting was over. "Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings," he said to Garrett. "I trust this transition can be handled professionally." Garrett looked between us one final time, perhaps hoping for some sign that this was all an elaborate joke or a temporary punishment that could be negotiated away. 43 years, I said, as he reached for the door handle. 43 years of building something meaningful, of creating value, of earning respect through actual achievement rather than inherited privilege. You might consider what that means before you decide what kind of man you want to become next. The door closed behind him with the soft finality of endings. Harrison poured 2 glasses of bourbon from the bottle he kept for special occasions. "Well," he said, handing me one, "that was even more dramatic than I'd hoped." Indeed. I accepted the glass, feeling lighter than I had in years. Though I suspect the real drama is just beginning. Meaning? Meaning that Garrett is going to go home to his wife and discover that she's facing criminal charges for embezzlement. Meaning they're going to realize that their comfortable lifestyle was built entirely on the generosity of the man they called dead weight. Harrison's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "Walter Morrison, you magnificent bastard. What else have you been planning?" I smiled and sipped the excellent bourbon, savoring both its warmth and the satisfaction of justice finally served. Let's just say that underestimating people based on appearances can be a very expensive mistake. Garrett and Vanessa are about to learn that lesson in ways they never anticipated. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrison's office, I could see the Seattle skyline stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, my son was coming to terms with the complete destruction of everything he thought he knew about power, family, and his own place in the world. The education of Garrett Cook was far from over, but the first phase had been completed with devastating effectiveness. Now came the aftermath, when he would have to rebuild his life without the hidden advantages he'd never known he possessed. I raised my glass toward the window, offering a silent toast to new beginnings and hard-earned wisdom. To retirement, I said to Harrison, properly defined as the freedom to reveal who you've always been. The afternoon stretched ahead of us like a blank canvas, full of possibilities that Garrett was only beginning to imagine. 2 hours later, I sat in the back of a taxi heading home, having declined Harrison's offer of a company car and driver. The simple act of choosing my own transportation felt like a small but significant declaration of independence after days of depending on Garrett for rides to and from my supposed employment. The house looked different as the taxi pulled into the driveway, no longer a place where I existed at someone else's sufferance, but property I owned, a home I'd earned through decades of hard work and smart investments. The perspective shift was both subtle and profound. I paid the driver and walked up the front steps with the confidence of someone who belonged there, not as a dependent elderly relative, but as Walter Morrison, successful businessman, respected investor, and a man who'd just reclaimed his proper place in the world. The front door was locked, which struck me as odd since Vanessa typically arrived home from work around 4:30 p.m. I used my key and entered a house that felt transformed by the day's revelations. "Vanessa?" I called out. "Anyone home?" Silence greeted me, though I could see light coming from the kitchen. As I walked through the living room, I noticed several boxes stacked near the doorway, hastily packed and sealed with tape. Clothing, books, and personal items visible through partially open flaps. In the kitchen, I found a note propped against the coffee maker, written in Vanessa's precise handwriting. "Walter, by the time you read this, we'll be gone. Garrett called me at work after being fired and explained what happened. We can't face you after what we've done. We're staying with my sister until we can figure out what comes next. I know this doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry. We were wrong about everything. Vanessa P.S. The keys are on the counter." I set the note down and looked around the kitchen where this entire drama had begun just 1 week earlier. The same table where they'd called me deadweight, the same chairs where they'd planned my exile to a nursing home, the same space where I'd announced my retirement and watched my family transform into strangers. Now the house was quiet, empty except for me and the echoes of revelations that had shattered their carefully constructed assumptions about power and dependency. I made myself a cup of coffee using the expensive machine I'd bought months ago but had never used in front of them, maintaining the fiction that such luxuries were beyond my means. The coffee was excellent, rich and smooth in a way that seemed to embody the freedom I'd finally reclaimed. From the kitchen window, I could see the garden I'd tended for years, always careful to buy plants from discount nurseries rather than the expensive specialty shops I actually preferred. No more such pretenses were necessary. No more playing the role of the modestly situated retiree dependent on his son's generosity. My phone buzzed with a text message from Harrison. "How did they take the news of your true circumstances?" I replied, "They didn't. They packed up and left rather than face the conversation. Probably for the best. Some lessons require distance to be properly absorbed." Indeed, perhaps Garrett and Vanessa needed time away from the comfortable assumptions they'd built their lives around. Perhaps discovering that their safety net had been the very person they'd dismissed as deadweight would eventually teach them something about respect, humility, and the danger of judging people by appearances rather than character. Or perhaps not. Some people learned from their mistakes, and others simply found new ways to repeat them. I walked through the house, seeing it with fresh eyes. The modest furnishings I'd chosen to reinforce my image as a man of limited means. The carefully maintained appearance of someone getting by on a pension, rather than thriving on investment returns. The entire elaborate performance I'd maintained for years to avoid corrupting my family with unearned privilege. In my small bedroom, I opened the locked file cabinet that contained documents Garrett and Vanessa had never seen. Portfolio statements, property deeds, business contracts, and investment records that told the real story of Walter Morrison's financial situation. The modest lifestyle hadn't been poverty. It had been a choice, a deliberate decision to live simply while building wealth quietly. The old clothes weren't a necessity. They were camouflage for someone who preferred substance over display. The careful budgeting wasn't desperation. It was the discipline that had enabled me to accumulate resources they'd never suspected existed. I selected one particular document from the files, the deed to the house where we'd all lived for the past 8 years. Property purchased outright, no mortgage, no debt, just a clean title in the name of Walter Morrison. Garrett had never questioned how his father could afford such a nice home on a factory worker's pension, perhaps assuming it was inherited or subsidized by family money he didn't understand. Another document caught my attention, the life insurance policy that would have provided Garrett and Vanessa with more wealth than they'd ever imagined if they'd been able to wait for natural inheritance rather than trying to seize control of what they assumed was a meager pension. But those were considerations for the future. Tonight was about the satisfaction of truth finally revealed, of dignity restored, and of lessons delivered with the precision that only comes from careful planning and patient execution. I prepared a simple dinner for one, using ingredients I'd always been able to afford, but had carefully rationed to maintain appearances. The meal tasted better than any I'd eaten in years, seasoned with the knowledge that I was finally free to be myself without pretense or performance. As evening settled over the house, I called Harrison to discuss tomorrow's board meeting agenda and my transition back to active participation in company leadership. We talked for nearly an hour about strategic planning, investment opportunities, and the satisfaction of business conducted between equals rather than between a supposed employer and his charity case janitor. Later I sat in the living room with a glass of wine, not the cheap bottle we'd kept for special occasions, but a proper vintage from the private collection I'd maintained in the basement storage room Garrett had never explored. Through the large windows I could see Seattle's lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, my son and daughter-in-law were discovering what life felt like without the hidden advantages they'd never known they possessed. They were learning that the world could be a harsh place for people without resources, connections, or the wisdom to recognize opportunity when it presented itself. Perhaps this experience would teach them empathy for those who genuinely struggled. Perhaps they'd develop appreciation for the privileges they'd taken for granted. Perhaps they'd emerge as better people, humbled by hardship and educated by consequences. Or perhaps they'd simply find new people to blame for their circumstances, new excuses for their failures, new ways to avoid taking responsibility for the choices that had led them to this moment. Either way, the lesson had been delivered with surgical precision. Walter Morrison was no longer the dependent elderly father grateful for minimum wage employment. He was exactly who he'd always been, a successful businessman, a strategic thinker, and a man who'd learned the difference between being underestimated and being weak. The retirement I'd announced 1 week ago had finally begun, not as the desperate plea of someone financially dependent on his family's charity, but as the earned reward of someone who'd built something meaningful and substantial over 4 decades of disciplined effort. I raised my wine glass toward the window, offering a silent toast to new beginnings, hard-earned wisdom, and the sweet satisfaction of justice properly served. Tomorrow would bring fresh possibilities. Tonight was for savoring the moment when appearances finally aligned with reality, when respect was restored, and when the true balance of power in the Morrison family was revealed for all to see. The house settled around me with creaks and sighs, no longer the domain of someone who existed at others' sufferance, but the comfortable sanctuary of someone who'd finally reclaimed his proper place in the world. Walter Morrison was retired at last, free to be exactly who he'd always been beneath the carefully maintained facade of modest dependency. The performance was over, the truth was revealed, and the education of his ungrateful family was finally complete. In the quiet satisfaction of that realization, I finished my wine and prepared for the first truly restful night's sleep I'd enjoyed in years. If you enjoyed this story of retirement, respect, and perfectly served justice, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts about Walter's elaborate revelation in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful people are those who choose to appear powerless, until the moment comes to reveal who they really are.